The marble steps of the downtown courthouse seemed to stretch endlessly upward as Margaret Caldwell climbed them one careful step at a time, her modest navy dress and worn leather handbag making her appear almost invisible among the morning's parade of lawyers and plaintiffs. The October wind caught her graying hair, pulling loose strands across her face as she paused at the top, looking back at the street below where ordinary people went about their ordinary lives, unaware that inside these imposing walls, her 23-year marriage was about to be dissected like a laboratory specimen. I wonder how many of you watching this have ever felt completely powerless in a situation where everything seemed stacked against you. Maybe you're tuning in from a place where you've experienced something similar, or perhaps you're watching from somewhere that feels safe and secure. Either way, I'd love to hear where you're watching from in the comments below, because this story about Margaret is going to take us all on a journey that proves things aren't always what they seem. Margaret pushed through the heavy bronze doors, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor as she made her way toward courtroom 7B. The sound of her own breathing seemed amplified in the vast corridor, mixing with the distant murmur of other legal proceedings and the steady click of high heels that she knew belonged to someone much more confident than herself. She had been dreading this day for months, ever since David had served her with divorce papers through his attorney, but she had also been preparing for it in ways that no one, especially David, could possibly imagine. The courtroom doors stood open like the mouth of some great beast, and Margaret hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. The space felt cavernous, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling that seemed designed to intimidate rather than comfort. Rows of gallery seats stretched behind the main floor, and already she could see familiar faces filling them. David's business associates, restaurant managers, and various friends who had taken his side in the dissolution of their marriage. They watched her enter with expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed amusement, as if they were about to witness some sort of entertainment rather than the legal ending of a human relationship. Margaret took her seat at the plaintiff's table, where her attorney was already arranging papers with hands that trembled slightly. Robert Hendricks was young, probably fresh out of law school, and his nervous energy filled the space around him like static electricity. David had chosen his legal representation carefully, securing the services of Harrison, Blackwell and Associates, one of the city's most prestigious firms. Margaret had chosen Robert because he was what she could supposedly afford, and because his inexperience served her purposes in ways that would become clear soon enough. The sound of expensive leather shoes against marble announced David's arrival before Margaret even turned to look. David Thornton entered the courtroom like a king returning to his throne, his charcoal gray suit perfectly tailored, his silver hair styled to perfection, and his smile radiating the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. Behind him walked Veronica Sterling, the woman who had ended their marriage, though Margaret had known about the affair for almost 2 years before David realized she knew. Veronica wore a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon, and her jewelry catching the courtroom lights like small stars. David's attorney, Patricia Blackwell herself, followed them with the bearing of a general preparing for a battle she had won many times before. Her reputation for destroying opposing parties in divorce proceedings was legendary, and the way she carried her briefcase suggested it contained weapons rather than legal documents. She nodded curtly to Robert, who swallowed hard and adjusted his tie for the 3rd time in as many minutes. The gallery continued to fill with David's supporters, and Margaret could hear their whispered conversations like a low hum of anticipation. They spoke about David's restaurant empire, his real estate investments, his business acumen, and his unfortunate marriage to a woman who had contributed nothing to his success. They discussed Veronica's career in marketing, her sophistication, her obvious superiority to the frumpy housewife David was finally discarding. Margaret listened to every word with the patience of someone who had spent decades learning to hear things that others thought she could not understand. When Judge Harrison took the bench, his presence commanded immediate silence. He was a man in his 60s with gray eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for running his courtroom with military precision. Margaret had researched him thoroughly, just as she had researched everything else about this proceeding, and she knew his history of fair but decisive rulings. He surveyed the assembled parties with the expression of someone who had seen every possible variation of human greed and self-deception. Patricia Blackwell rose to address the court, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. She outlined her client's position with surgical precision, describing David as a self-made entrepreneur who had built a successful business empire through his own hard work and vision. She painted Margaret as a dependent spouse who had contributed nothing substantial to the marriage's financial success, who had been content to live off her husband's earnings while pursuing no meaningful career of her own. Margaret watched David's face as his attorney spoke, noting the way his smile grew wider with each dismissive reference to his soon-to-be former wife. He had always underestimated her, even in the early days of their marriage when she had been young and genuinely naive. But Margaret had not remained naive, and the years had taught her things about patience and strategy that David would never comprehend. Veronica sat beside David with the satisfied expression of a woman who believed she had already won the greatest prize. She touched David's arm possessively during the proceedings, a gesture meant as much for Margaret's benefit as for her own satisfaction. Her confidence radiated through every carefully chosen accessory, every perfectly applied cosmetic, every calculated glance toward the gallery where David's supporters watched approvingly. Robert fumbled through his opening statement, clearly overwhelmed by the opposing counsel's presentation and the intimidating atmosphere of the courtroom. He made weak references to Margaret's contributions to the marriage, her years of support for David's career, and her right to fair compensation. His arguments sounded hollow even to Margaret's ears, exactly as she had hoped they would. The morning session proceeded with the predictable rhythm of David's apparent victory. Document after document established his business ownership, his financial acumen, his role as the marriage's sole breadwinner. Margaret's name appeared nowhere on the corporate paperwork, nowhere on the property deeds, nowhere in the complex web of investments and holdings that comprised David's empire. To any observer, she appeared to be exactly what Patricia Blackwell claimed she was, a woman who had married well and contributed little. But Margaret sat through it all with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural given the circumstances. While Robert grew increasingly flustered and David's confidence soared to dangerous heights, Margaret simply listened and watched and waited for the moment when everything would change. Because despite appearances, despite the overwhelming evidence of her powerlessness, despite the mockery she could feel emanating from the gallery behind her, Margaret Caldwell had never been powerless at all. She had simply been very, very patient. The afternoon session began with Patricia Blackwell presenting David's financial empire like a master artist unveiling a prized collection. She moved through the courtroom with practiced elegance, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority as she detailed each component of what she termed David's remarkable business success. The overhead projector displayed colorful charts and graphs that transformed David's holdings into an impressive visual narrative of entrepreneurial triumph. David owned 7 upscale restaurants throughout the metropolitan area, each one a testament to his supposed vision and business acumen. The Thornton Grill downtown served as the flagship establishment, its mahogany interior and crystal chandeliers attracting the city's elite for power lunches and anniversary celebrations. The other locations followed similar patterns of elegant dining and premium pricing, creating what Patricia described as a carefully orchestrated empire of culinary excellence. Beyond the restaurants, David's portfolio included 3 commercial real estate properties, 2 luxury condominiums that he rented to high-profile clients, and a sprawling estate in the hills that served as both family home and symbol of his achievements. Patricia presented each acquisition with precise dates and purchase prices, creating a timeline that seemed to document David's steady climb from ambitious young man to established businessman. Margaret listened to the recitation of assets with the same serene expression she had maintained throughout the morning, occasionally making small notes on the legal pad before her, while Robert shifted nervously in his chair. The gallery behind her murmured appreciatively at each revelation of David's wealth, their whispered comments painting him as exactly the sort of successful man who deserved to escape an unsatisfying marriage. When Patricia called David to the witness stand, he rose with the confidence of a man who had spent years commanding rooms full of employees, investors, and admirers. His testimony flowed smoothly as he described his journey from restaurant manager to owner, his strategic decisions regarding location and cuisine, his careful cultivation of wealthy clientele who kept his establishments profitable year after year. David spoke about the long hours he had invested in building his business, the risks he had taken with his own money, the sleepless nights spent worrying about payroll and inventory and customer satisfaction. He painted himself as a self-made man who had sacrificed personal comfort for professional success, who had earned every dollar through his own determination and skill. When Patricia asked about Margaret's role in his business ventures, David's expression shifted to one of patient resignation, as if discussing a disappointing but familiar topic. Margaret had provided emotional support during the difficult early years, he acknowledged, but she had never shown interest in the actual operations of his restaurants. She preferred to remain home, he explained, focusing on domestic matters while he handled the complexities of running multiple businesses. Margaret had occasionally suggested menu items or decorating ideas, David continued, but her contributions had been minimal and largely impractical. She lacked the business instincts necessary for serious entrepreneurial endeavors, and David had learned early in their marriage that major decisions required his sole attention and expertise. The courtroom listened to David's testimony with the rapt attention of an audience watching a compelling performance. His voice carried just the right mixture of respect for his wife's domestic efforts and subtle disappointment in her limited professional capabilities. He never spoke harshly about Margaret, but his carefully chosen words created an unmistakable impression of a woman who had been carried along by her husband's success rather than contributing to it. Veronica took the witness stand next, her testimony serving to reinforce David's narrative while establishing her own credentials as a more suitable partner for a man of his stature. She described her career in marketing with the confidence of someone who had genuinely achieved professional success through her own efforts. Her client list included several major corporations, and her annual income placed her firmly in the upper middle class. Veronica spoke about meeting David at a business networking event, where his passion for his restaurants and his vision for expansion had immediately impressed her. She described their relationship as a partnership between equals, two ambitious professionals who understood the demands of building and maintaining successful careers. Their conversations covered market trends, investment strategies, and business development, topics that apparently held no interest for Margaret. When Patricia asked about Margaret's employment history, the courtroom grew particularly attentive. Veronica explained that David had described his wife as someone who had never pursued serious career opportunities, who had been content to live comfortably on his earnings while contributing little to their financial security. Margaret had worked briefly as a receptionist early in their marriage, but she had left that position after only 6 months and never sought comparable employment again. The implication hung in the air like incense, heavy and unmistakable. Margaret represented the outdated model of a dependent wife, while Veronica embodied the modern woman who brought her own assets and ambitions to a relationship. The contrast served David's interests perfectly, suggesting that his desire for divorce stemmed not from mere infidelity, but from his natural evolution toward a more suitable partner. Robert's cross-examination of both David and Veronica proved painfully inadequate to the task of challenging their narrative. His questions meandered without clear direction, failing to expose any contradictions or weaknesses in their carefully constructed story. He asked about Margaret's emotional support during difficult periods, about her role in entertaining David's business associates, about her management of their household during his frequent travel. David acknowledged these contributions with the patronizing gratitude of someone discussing a valued but replaceable service provider. Margaret had indeed handled social obligations competently, and she had maintained their home efficiently, but these domestic accomplishments hardly compared to the complex challenges of running multiple businesses and managing substantial investments. When Robert asked about the timeline of David's business acquisitions, Patricia objected repeatedly to questions she deemed irrelevant to the divorce proceedings. Judge Harrison sustained most of her objections, leaving Robert's inquiry fragmented and ineffective. The young attorney grew increasingly flustered as his attempts to challenge David's testimony fell apart under Patricia's precise legal maneuvering. Margaret watched the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a chess match where the outcome had been determined long before the first move. Robert's performance was exactly what she had expected, serving her purposes in ways that would become clear when the time came for revelation. David's growing confidence, Veronica's obvious satisfaction, and the gallery's murmured approval all contributed to the facade that would make the eventual truth more devastating. During a brief recess, Margaret overheard conversations in the hallway that confirmed her assessment of public opinion. David's business associates discussed his remarkable achievement in building such a successful empire, while expressing sympathy for his unfortunate marriage to a woman who clearly lacked his ambition and vision. Several people mentioned Veronica's obvious superiority as a partner, praising her professional accomplishments and sophisticated demeanor. Margaret bought a cup of coffee from the courthouse vending machine and found a quiet corner where she could review her notes while listening to the continued commentary about her apparent inadequacy. The irony was so profound that she almost smiled, but she maintained her expression of resigned defeat. Every word of praise for David's business acumen, every dismissive reference to her own contributions, every confident prediction about the divorce settlement added another layer to the foundation she had spent years constructing. When the afternoon session resumed, Patricia presented additional documentation supporting David's sole ownership of all marital assets. Bank statements, corporate filings, property deeds, and investment records all bore David's name exclusively. The paper trail appeared comprehensive and unambiguous, establishing a clear legal framework for Patricia's argument that David should retain virtually all assets while providing Margaret with minimal support. The final witness of the day was David's accountant, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who testified about the complexity of David's financial holdings and the skill required to manage such diverse investments. He spoke about tax strategies, depreciation schedules, and market analysis with the dry precision of someone who lived entirely in the world of numbers and regulations. Margaret's financial situation, by contrast, appeared remarkably simple. A modest checking account, a small savings account, and no investments or properties in her name. The accountant's testimony painted her as someone who had never engaged with financial planning or wealth management, someone who had been content to let her husband handle such matters while she focused on less demanding pursuits. As the day's proceedings concluded, Margaret gathered her papers with the same careful attention she brought to all her activities. David and Veronica left the courtroom surrounded by their supporters, their conversation already turning to dinner plans and post-divorce celebrations. Robert packed his briefcase with the defeated air of someone who knew he was overmatched by superior opposition. But Margaret walked toward the courthouse exit with the steady pace of someone who had spent the day exactly as she had planned. Every confident assertion by David's team, every dismissive reference to her contributions, every piece of evidence supporting his sole ownership of their accumulated wealth had been carefully noted and filed away for future reference. Because Margaret Caldwell had been keeping her own records for a very long time, and those records told a completely different story. The second day of proceedings began with an atmosphere of barely contained celebration from David's side of the courtroom. His supporters filled the gallery with the energy of people attending a victory party rather than a legal proceeding, their conversations buzzing with excitement about the previous day's revelations and confident predictions about the inevitable outcome. Margaret arrived early, as was her habit, observing the growing crowd with the same patient attention she brought to everything else. David entered the courtroom like a conquering general, his stride longer and more confident than it had been even the day before. The night had apparently done wonders for his mood, and he greeted his attorney and supporters with the expansive warmth of a man who saw his future stretching ahead in exactly the shape he had always wanted it to take. Veronica walked beside him wearing a pale yellow dress that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows, her smile radiant with anticipation. Before the formal session began, Margaret could hear David discussing his post-divorce business plans with an enthusiasm that carried clearly across the courtroom. He spoke about expanding the restaurant chain into neighboring cities, about purchasing additional commercial properties, about developing a catering service that would serve the growing corporate market. His voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted his ability to achieve whatever goals he set for himself. Veronica contributed her own expertise to these conversations, offering insights about marketing strategies and brand development that impressed David's business associates. She spoke about leveraging social media platforms to increase restaurant visibility, about creating exclusive membership programs for high-value customers, about developing partnerships with local suppliers to reduce costs and improve quality. Her suggestions demonstrated both professional competence and personal investment in David's continued success. The contrast with Margaret could not have been more stark or more deliberate. While David and Veronica planned their shared future with obvious excitement, Margaret sat quietly at her table, occasionally making notes but contributing nothing to the animated discussions surrounding her. To any observer, she appeared to be a woman already defeated, someone who understood that her role in David's life had ended and was simply waiting for the legal formalities to conclude. Robert arrived looking even more overwhelmed than he had the previous day, his briefcase bulging with papers that he shuffled through nervously while trying to prepare for what everyone expected would be the final phase of the proceedings. Patricia Blackwell, by contrast, appeared supremely confident, her every gesture suggesting that she considered the case already won and was simply going through the necessary motions to make the victory official. When Judge Harrison called the court to order, David's supporters settled into their seats with the expectant silence of an audience waiting for the final act of a play whose ending they already knew. Patricia rose to continue her presentation with the measured pace of someone who had complete control over the proceedings and intended to savor every moment of her client's triumph. She called several character witnesses who testified about David's reputation in the business community, his charitable contributions, and his standing as a respected member of society. These witnesses painted him as exactly the sort of man who deserved to retain his wealth and freedom, someone whose unfortunate marriage had clearly been a mistake that should not be allowed to damage his future prospects. The restaurant managers who testified spoke about David's Hanson leadership style, his attention to detail, and his ability to make the difficult decisions that separated successful businessmen from those who merely dreamed about success. They described him as someone who worked longer hours than his employees, who understood every aspect of restaurant operations, and who had built his empire through personal sacrifice and unwavering dedication. Several prominent customers took the stand to praise David's establishments and to confirm his reputation for excellence. They spoke about important business deals concluded over dinner at the Thorn and Grill, about anniversary celebrations made memorable by David's personal attention to detail, about the consistent quality that made his restaurants the preferred choice for discerning diners throughout the metropolitan area. Margaret listened to these testimonials with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout the proceedings, occasionally glancing toward the gallery where David's supporters nodded approvingly at each positive reference to his character and accomplishments. The cumulative effect of the testimony was overwhelming in its support for David's position, creating an atmosphere where any challenge to his version of events seemed not just unlikely, but almost absurd. When Patricia called David back to the witness stand for additional testimony, his confidence had reached levels that bordered on the theatrical. He spoke about his vision for the future with the enthusiasm of someone describing a beautiful dream that was about to become reality. His expansion plans were detailed and ambitious, his financial projections optimistic, but grounded in careful market analysis. David described the new restaurants he intended to open, including a fine dining establishment that would cater to the city's most affluent residents and a casual concept designed to capture the growing market for upscale comfort food. He spoke about hiring additional management staff, about implementing new technology systems, about developing signature dishes that would distinguish his brand from competitors. His testimony included frequent references to Veronica's role in these future plans, emphasizing her professional qualifications and her ability to contribute meaningfully to his business strategies. David made it clear that his next chapter would be shared with someone who understood and appreciated his ambitions, someone whose own career success made her a true partner rather than a dependent burden. The implicit criticism of Margaret grew more pronounced as David continued his testimony. He spoke about the importance of having a spouse who shared business interests, who could contribute intelligent insights about market trends and customer preferences, who understood the demands of entrepreneurial success. His words never directly attacked Margaret, but they created an unmistakable impression of a man who had outgrown his current situation and was ready to move forward with someone more suited to his level of achievement. Veronica's testimony reinforced every point David had made while adding her own perspective about their shared future. She spoke about wedding plans that included a reception at the Thornton Grill, about honeymoon travel to European cities where they would visit renowned restaurants for inspiration, about the home they intended to purchase in an exclusive neighborhood that would reflect their combined success. Her confidence in discussing these future plans suggested that she considered the divorce proceedings a mere formality, an administrative task that needed to be completed before the real celebration could begin. She spoke about David's character with the conviction of someone who had found her ideal partner, praising his intelligence, his work ethic, and his ability to build something meaningful from nothing. When Patricia asked about Margaret's likely future, Veronica's response was carefully measured but unmistakably condescending. Margaret would undoubtedly find happiness in a simpler lifestyle more suited to her temperament and capabilities, Veronica suggested. Perhaps she would discover interests in activities that had been neglected during her marriage to such an ambitious man. The change might actually benefit her by allowing her to focus on pursuits that required less pressure and responsibility. The gallery responded to these testimonies with murmured approval, their conversations during breaks revealing complete acceptance of David and Veronica's narrative. Margaret's future was discussed with the dismissive sympathy reserved for someone whose best years were clearly behind her, someone who would need to adjust her expectations to match her reduced circumstances. Robert's attempts to challenge this narrative proved even more ineffective than his previous efforts. His questions lacked focus and failed to expose any contradictions in the confident testimonies he was hearing. When he tried to ask about Margaret's contributions to David's early business success, Patricia's objections consistently prevented him from developing any coherent line of inquiry. During the lunch recess, Margaret overheard David and Veronica discussing their afternoon plans with several friends. They spoke about viewing potential wedding venues, about meeting with an interior designer to discuss renovating David's estate, about scheduling a consultation with a travel agent to plan their European honeymoon. Their conversation bubbled with the excitement of people who saw their dreams becoming reality. Margaret purchased a simple sandwich from the courthouse cafeteria and found a quiet corner where she could eat while reviewing her notes from the morning session. Around her, other divorce proceedings continued their predictable patterns of accusation and defense, settlement negotiation, and asset division. The legal system ground through its daily business with mechanical efficiency, transforming human relationships into financial calculations and custody arrangements. When the afternoon session resumed, Patricia presented her final arguments with the confidence of someone who had successfully proven every point she had set out to establish. David's sole ownership of all marital assets had been documented beyond any reasonable doubt. Margaret's minimal contributions to their financial success had been clearly demonstrated. The case for awarding David virtually everything while providing Margaret with modest support appeared overwhelming. Patricia requested that the court award David full ownership of all business assets, all real estate holdings, and all investment accounts, arguing that these represented the fruits of his individual labor and entrepreneurial vision. She suggested that Margaret receive a minimal monthly support payment for a limited period, enough to help her transition to independence, but not sufficient to burden David's future business operations. Robert's closing argument was brief and ineffective, a weak plea for fairness that failed to challenge any of the substantive evidence Patricia had presented. He asked the court to consider Margaret's years of emotional support and domestic contributions, but his words carried no legal weight against the overwhelming documentation of David's sole ownership of all significant assets. As the day's proceedings concluded, David's supporters began making plans for a celebration dinner that would mark the end of his unfortunate marriage and the beginning of his new life with Veronica. Their conversations were loud enough for Margaret to hear clearly, filled with congratulations and predictions about David's continued success. Margaret gathered her papers with the same methodical care she brought to everything else, her expression revealing nothing about her thoughts as she prepared to leave the courthouse. Tomorrow would bring the final arguments and Judge Harrison's decision, but everyone in the courtroom already knew what that decision would be. Everyone, that is, except Margaret herself, who had spent the day listening to confident predictions about a future that would never come to pass. Because Margaret had been waiting for exactly this moment, when David's arrogance had reached its absolute peak and his guard was completely down. Tomorrow, Robert would finally present the additional documentation he had mentioned in passing, and everything that David and Veronica believed about their future would change in ways they could never have imagined. The third day dawned with an unusual tension that seemed to permeate the courthouse atmosphere from the moment the building opened its doors. Margaret arrived even earlier than her customary time, carrying a small leather portfolio that she had not brought to the previous sessions. Her demeanor remained outwardly calm, but there was something different about her posture, a subtle shift that suggested the patient observer was preparing to become an active participant. David and Veronica entered the courtroom with the same confident energy they had displayed throughout the proceedings, but their celebration from the previous evening had left them slightly less sharp than usual. They spoke in lower tones about wedding details and business expansion, their voices carrying the satisfied exhaustion of people who had stayed up too late discussing their bright future. Patricia Blackwell arrived with her usual commanding presence, but she too seemed to be operating on the assumption that today would bring nothing more than routine closing arguments and Judge Harrison's expected ruling in their favor. She carried fewer documents than she had on previous days, her briefcase containing what appeared to be mostly standard forms and settlement papers. Robert, however, appeared different. The nervous energy that had characterized his previous performances had been replaced by something that resembled determination. He moved with more purpose as he arranged his materials, and when he spoke quietly with Margaret, his voice carried a confidence that had been entirely absent from his earlier efforts. Judge Harrison called the court to order with his usual efficiency, but his expression suggested that he sensed the same unusual tension that had been building in the courtroom. His eyes moved carefully between the opposing tables, taking note of Robert's altered demeanor and the subtle changes in Margaret's positioning at the plaintiff's table. Patricia rose to make what everyone expected would be her final presentation, a summary of the overwhelming evidence supporting David's position and a formal request for the court to award him essentially everything of value from the marriage. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never doubted the outcome of the proceedings, someone who was simply following a script that had been written from the moment the case began. But when Patricia concluded her presentation and Judge Harrison called for Robert's response, the young attorney stood with a confidence that immediately changed the atmosphere in the courtroom. Instead of the hesitant, rambling arguments he had presented previously, Robert spoke with clear purpose about additional evidence that had come to his attention. Robert announced that he wished to present supplementary financial documentation that had been recently discovered and properly authenticated. Patricia immediately objected, arguing that any new evidence should have been submitted during the discovery phase of the proceedings. But Robert calmly explained that the documents in question had been in Margaret's possession all along and were entirely relevant to the court's determination of asset ownership. Judge Harrison allowed the presentation to proceed, and Robert approached his table to retrieve a series of documents that Margaret handed him with steady hands. The first document was a bank statement from an institution that no one in the courtroom recognized, showing an account balance that made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Robert asked David if he was familiar with the Cayman National Bank, and David's confident expression flickered for just a moment before he replied that he had no knowledge of any accounts at that institution. Robert then presented additional statements showing accounts at banks in Switzerland, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas, each one containing substantial balances that dwarfed the domestic assets that had been the focus of Patricia's presentation. David's face began to show the first signs of genuine confusion as Robert continued his methodical presentation of foreign banking documents. When asked about each institution, David consistently denied any knowledge of the accounts or the substantial funds they contained. His answers grew shorter and more defensive as the list of offshore holdings continued to expand. Patricia objected repeatedly to the relevance of these documents, arguing that her client's lack of knowledge about these accounts proved that they were unrelated to the marital assets under consideration. But Robert countered that the accounts were opened with funds that could be traced directly to the early capitalization of David's business ventures. Veronica's confident smile began to fade as she listened to the exchange between Robert and David. She leaned forward in her seat, straining to hear every word as David continued to deny knowledge of financial holdings that appeared to total more than all of his domestic assets combined. Her expression shifted from puzzlement to concern as she began to realize that David might have been less than completely honest about his financial situation. Robert then presented documentation showing wire transfers from the offshore accounts that corresponded exactly with the dates when David had supposedly invested his own money in restaurant purchases and real estate acquisitions. The transfers showed a clear pattern of foreign funds being converted to domestic investments, creating the business empire that David claimed to have built with his own resources. David's attorney requested a brief recess to review the unexpected documentation, but Judge Harrison denied the request and instructed Robert to continue his presentation. The courtroom had grown completely silent, with even David's supporters straining to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Margaret spoke for the first time during the entire proceedings, her voice clear and steady as she addressed the court directly. She explained that the offshore accounts had been established with funds from her family trust, money that had been available to her since her 21st birthday, but which she had never mentioned to David during their marriage. The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Margaret continued speaking in the same calm tone, explaining that she had funded David's entire business expansion through carefully structured transfers that allowed him to believe he was using his own resources. Every restaurant purchase, every real estate acquisition, every investment that David had proudly claimed as evidence of his business acumen had been made possible by Margaret's family wealth. David's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into growing horror as he began to understand the implications of Margaret's revelation. He turned to look at Veronica, whose own expression had shifted from concern to something approaching panic. Patricia attempted to challenge Margaret's testimony, arguing that such substantial financial arrangements would have required David's knowledge and consent. But Margaret calmly produced a series of legal documents showing that she had been granted power of attorney over certain financial matters early in their marriage, documentation that David had signed without reading carefully because he had trusted his wife to handle what he assumed were minor administrative details. The power of attorney gave Margaret the legal authority to manage family trust assets for the benefit of both spouses, including the right to make investments and transfers without David's specific knowledge or consent. David's signature on the documents was clearly authentic, validated by the same notary public who had handled many of their other legal affairs over the years. Robert presented additional evidence showing that the business entities David claimed to own were actually structured with Margaret as the majority shareholder, hidden behind layers of legal entities that had been carefully constructed to protect the family trust assets while allowing David to operate the businesses as if he were the sole owner. Veronica's face had gone pale as she absorbed the full implications of what she was hearing. The successful businessman she had planned to marry was revealing himself to be entirely dependent on the quiet woman he had dismissed and humiliated. The empire she had expected to share was built on foundations that belonged to someone else entirely. David attempted to interrupt Margaret's testimony several times, his voice rising as he demanded explanations for financial arrangements he claimed never to have authorized. But Margaret's calm responses, supported by Robert's systematic presentation of legal documents, made it clear that every transaction had been properly authorized and legally executed. The gallery, which had buzzed with confident conversation throughout the previous sessions, had fallen into stunned silence. David's business associates and supporters found themselves witnessing the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew about his financial success. The man they had admired as a self-made entrepreneur was being revealed as someone who had built his reputation on resources he had never understood or controlled. Margaret's revelation continued with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire approach to the marriage. She explained that she had maintained detailed records of every transfer, every investment, and every business decision that had been funded with her family money. The leather portfolio she had brought to court contained copies of documents that tracked 23 years of financial support disguised as David's independent success. As the morning session drew to a close, David sat in stunned silence while Veronica stared at him with an expression that mixed betrayal with dawning comprehension. The confident predictions and celebration plans that had dominated their previous conversations now seemed like cruel jokes played by people who had never understood the reality of their situation. Judge Harrison announced a lunch recess with instructions for both parties to prepare for afternoon testimony that would address the full implications of Margaret's revelations. As the courtroom emptied, David's supporters filed out in confused silence, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by the uncomfortable awareness that they had been witnessing something entirely different from what they had believed. Margaret remained seated at her table, organizing her papers with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. But for the first time during the proceedings, there was something in her expression that suggested satisfaction, the quiet pleasure of someone who had executed a plan that had been years in the making. The afternoon session would bring even more revelations, but the foundation for David's complete destruction had been laid. Every confident assertion he had made about his business acumen, every dismissive comment about Margaret's contributions, every future plan he had shared with Veronica would now be re-examined in the harsh light of reality. Margaret had waited 23 years for this moment, and she was just getting started. The afternoon session began with an atmosphere so thick with tension that it seemed to press against everyone present like a physical force. David and Veronica returned from the lunch break looking as though they had spent the time in heated discussion, their earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed panic and mutual accusations. David's face showed the strain of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered in the span of a single morning, while Veronica wore the expression of someone who had discovered that everything she thought she knew about her future was built on lies. Margaret entered the courtroom with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout the proceedings, but now there was something different about her bearing. The quiet resignation that had characterized her previous appearances had been replaced by an unmistakable sense of authority, as if she had finally stepped into a role she had been preparing to play for decades. Robert had transformed completely from the nervous young attorney who had fumbled through the earlier sessions. He moved with the confidence of someone who held winning cards and was ready to play them systematically. His briefcase now bulged with additional documentation, and his entire demeanor suggested that the morning's revelations had been merely the opening act of a much larger performance. Judge Harrison called the court to order with his characteristic efficiency, but his expression indicated that he understood the proceedings had entered entirely new territory. The comfortable assumptions that had guided the first 2 days had been completely overturned, and everyone present was now operating in uncharted legal waters. Robert announced that he wished to call a witness who had not been previously identified, and Patricia immediately objected to the introduction of surprise testimony. But Judge Harrison allowed the witness to be sworn in, and Margaret watched with satisfaction as Harrison Reed, Senior Vice President of Cayman National Bank, took the stand via video conference link. Reed's testimony began with a detailed explanation of the banking relationship that had existed between his institution and the Caldwell Family Trust for more than 40 years. He described Margaret as the primary beneficiary of a trust established by her grandfather, a textile manufacturer whose business empire had generated substantial wealth that had been carefully preserved and invested across multiple generations. The banker's testimony revealed that Margaret's trust fund contained assets totaling more than $50 million, invested in a diversified portfolio that included real estate, stocks, bonds, and various business ventures. Reed explained that Margaret had been granted access to these funds upon her 21st birthday, but had chosen to live modestly while using the trust assets to support what she described as her husband's business ventures. David's face went through a series of expressions that documented his complete psychological collapse. The revelation that his wife possessed wealth that dwarfed anything he had imagined was clearly devastating. But even more crushing was the realization that his entire business empire had been built with her money while he had spent decades believing himself to be a self-made success. Reed continued his testimony by detailing the specific transfers that had funded David's restaurant purchases, and real estate acquisitions. Every major business decision that David had proudly claimed as evidence of his entrepreneurial vision had been made possible by wire transfers from Margaret's offshore accounts. The systematic documentation showed that David had never invested a single dollar of his own money in any of his supposed achievements. Veronica's reaction to this testimony was almost as dramatic as David's. She had spent months planning a future based on sharing David's wealth and status, only to discover that both belonged entirely to the woman she had helped him humiliate and dismiss. Her face showed a mixture of betrayal and rage that she struggled to contain as the full implications of her situation became clear. Robert then presented additional documentation showing that the legal structure of David's businesses had been carefully designed to protect Margaret's interests while allowing him to operate as the apparent owner. Each restaurant, each piece of real estate, each investment account had been established with Margaret as the majority shareholder, hidden behind a complex web of trusts and corporate entities that David had never bothered to examine carefully. The revelation that Margaret legally owned everything David claimed to control sent shockwaves through the courtroom gallery. David's business associates and supporters found themselves witnessing the complete destruction of their colleague's reputation, watching as the successful entrepreneur they had admired was revealed to be entirely dependent on his wife's family fortune. Margaret took the stand to provide her own testimony about the financial arrangements she had maintained throughout their marriage. Her voice remained calm and steady as she explained that she had funded David's business ventures because she loved him and wanted him to achieve his dreams, but she had always maintained legal control over the assets to protect her family's wealth. She described her decision to remain silent about her financial resources as a test of David's character, a way to determine whether he would remain loyal and respectful if he believed her to be dependent on his support. Margaret explained that she had hoped David would prove worthy of her trust and her love, but his affair with Veronica and his cruel treatment during the divorce proceedings had demonstrated his true nature. Margaret's testimony revealed that she had been documenting David's behavior and business decisions for years, maintaining detailed records that would allow her to reclaim full control of her assets if necessary. She had never intended to destroy his career or his reputation, but his own choices had made such action inevitable. The leather portfolio Margaret had brought to court contained not only financial documents, but also correspondence between Margaret and her legal advisors dating back more than 5 years. The letters showed that she had been preparing for this possibility long before David had begun his affair, recognizing that their marriage was deteriorating and that she might need to protect her interests. David's attempt to testify in his own defense proved catastrophic. His voice shook as he claimed that he had never known about Margaret's wealth, that he had believed his business success was entirely the result of his own efforts. But Robert systematically demolished these claims by presenting documents that David had signed, contracts he had reviewed, and legal filings that clearly identified the source of funding for his ventures. Patricia's cross-examination of Margaret proved equally ineffective. Every challenge she raised was met with documentary evidence that supported Margaret's version of events. Patricia's attempts to argue that David had been deceived about the financial arrangements fell apart when confronted with his signatures on documents that explicitly outlined the trust funding for his businesses. The most devastating moment came when Robert presented evidence showing that David had known about Margaret's wealth for years, but had chosen to ignore the implications because acknowledging them would have undermined his self-image as a successful entrepreneur. Banking records showed that David had received regular statements and legal documents that clearly identified the source of funding for his ventures, but he had filed them away without reading them carefully. Veronica's testimony as a character witness for David backfired spectacularly when Robert asked her about her expectations for their future together. Her description of the lifestyle she had planned to share with David, based entirely on wealth that actually belonged to Margaret, highlighted the complete fraud that their relationship represented. The afternoon session also revealed that several of David's business associates had suspected the truth about his financial situation but had chosen to remain silent because the arrangement benefited their own interests. Restaurant managers testified that they had received payments from accounts that bore Margaret's name, and contractors admitted that construction projects had been funded through wire transfers from offshore institutions. The gallery, which had buzzed with confident conversation during the previous sessions, now sat in stunned silence as witness after witness confirmed that David's entire business empire was built on Margaret's money. The people who had celebrated his success and mocked her supposed dependence found themselves forced to confront the reality that they had been completely wrong about everything. Margaret's final testimony addressed her plans for the businesses that David had operated as his own. She explained that she intended to retain ownership of the restaurants and real estate, but she offered David the opportunity to continue working as a manager under her direction. The offer was made with the same calm dignity that had characterized all her statements, but the reversal of power was unmistakable. David's breakdown during Margaret's final testimony was complete and public. He shouted accusations and denials that only served to highlight his desperation and his complete misunderstanding of his situation. His outbursts were so disruptive that Judge Harrison threatened to hold him in contempt, and Patricia was forced to restrain her client physically to prevent further damage to his position. The revelation that Margaret had been secretly recording conversations with David about his affair and his plans for their divorce provided the final devastating blow to his credibility. The recordings, which were legally admissible because they had been made in Margaret's own home, captured David making cruel comments about his wife's supposed inadequacies and boasting about the minimal settlement he intended to offer her. Veronica's reaction to hearing these recordings was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the entire proceedings. The conversations revealed that David had been lying to her about his feelings for Margaret, claiming to feel guilty about the divorce, while privately expressing contempt for his wife's dependence and lack of sophistication. Veronica's face showed dawning comprehension that she had been manipulated as thoroughly as everyone else. As the afternoon session drew to a close, the complete reversal of power in the courtroom was unmistakable. Margaret sat at her table with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had executed a plan that had been decades in the making, while David slumped in his chair with the defeated posture of a man whose entire life had been revealed as an elaborate deception. The gallery filed out in stunned silence, David's former supporters avoiding eye contact as they processed the implications of what they had witnessed. The confident predictions and celebration plans that had dominated their earlier conversations now seemed like artifacts from a different universe, relics of a reality that had never actually existed. Margaret remained in her seat as the courtroom emptied, organizing her papers with the same methodical care she brought to everything else. But now there was unmistakable satisfaction in her expression, the quiet pleasure of someone who had endured years of condescension and mockery only to prove that the last laugh belonged to her. Tomorrow would bring Judge Harrison's final ruling, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The only remaining question was how completely Margaret would choose to destroy the life that David had built on her money, and whether she would show him the same mercy he had planned to show her. The final day arrived with an atmosphere of stunned anticipation that seemed to permeate every corner of the courthouse. Word of the previous day's revelations had spread through the legal community overnight, and the gallery filled with observers who came not to support David, but to witness the conclusion of what had become the most dramatic reversal in the courthouse's recent memory. Margaret entered with the bearing of someone who had already won, while David appeared hollow and defeated, his confident facade completely abandoned. Judge Harrison took the bench with the grave expression of someone who understood that his ruling would not merely end a marriage, but would serve as a final verdict on one of the most comprehensive deceptions he had encountered during his decades on the bench. The complete silence that greeted his entrance reflected the collective understanding that everything said previously had been rendered meaningless by Margaret's systematic demolition of David's claims. Patricia Blackwell's closing argument was a masterpiece of professional desperation, an attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her client's position that everyone in the courtroom knew was hopeless. She argued that David's ignorance of the true source of funding for his businesses should protect him from losing everything, that his genuine belief in his own success deserved some consideration from the court. But her words carried no conviction, and even Patricia seemed to understand that she was merely fulfilling a professional obligation rather than mounting a credible defense. The documentary evidence Margaret had presented was so comprehensive and damning that any attempt to challenge it would have bordered on the absurd. Robert's closing argument was brief and devastating in its simplicity. He merely summarized the evidence that proved Margaret's ownership of all assets in question, noted that David had never contributed any resources of his own to the marriage's accumulated wealth, and requested that the court award his client full control over property that had always legally belonged to her. Judge Harrison's ruling was delivered with the measured authority of someone announcing a verdict that had been dictated by the facts rather than determined through legal interpretation. He awarded Margaret full ownership of all businesses, all real estate holdings, and all investment accounts, noting that the evidence clearly established her as the sole source of funding for everything David had claimed to own. The judge's words fell into a courtroom so quiet that the sound of his voice seemed amplified beyond normal human speech. David sat motionless as he absorbed the complete destruction of everything he had believed about his life, while Veronica stared at him with an expression that mixed disgust with dawning comprehension of her own situation. Judge Harrison also ordered David to pay Margaret's legal fees and awarded her additional damages for the emotional distress caused by his affair and his attempts to defraud her during the divorce proceedings. The financial penalty was substantial enough to ensure that David would begin his new life with significant debt rather than the wealth he had expected to retain. As the judge concluded his ruling, Margaret stood with the dignity of someone who had achieved complete vindication after years of patient planning. Her expression showed satisfaction, but not cruelty, the quiet pleasure of someone who had proven a point rather than someone seeking revenge for its own sake. David's breakdown was immediate and complete. The man who had entered the courthouse 3 days earlier as a confident entrepreneur left as someone whose entire identity had been revealed as a carefully constructed fiction. His business associates and former supporters avoided eye contact as they filed out of the courtroom, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by embarrassment and the uncomfortable awareness that they had been witnesses to their own deception. Veronica's confrontation with David in the courthouse hallway was loud enough to draw attention from everyone within hearing distance. She accused him of lying about everything from his business success to his feelings about their relationship, her voice carrying the fury of someone who had discovered that her entire future had been built on deliberate deceptions. The argument revealed that Veronica had already begun making inquiries about David's true financial situation, discovering that without Margaret's support, he possessed virtually nothing of value. The restaurants and properties she had expected to help him manage were beyond his reach, and the lifestyle she had planned to share with him was impossible without resources he had never actually controlled. Margaret observed this confrontation with the detached interest of someone watching the natural consequences of actions she had not caused but had certainly predicted. When David approached her outside the courthouse to attempt some form of reconciliation or negotiation, Margaret's response was delivered with the same calm authority that had characterized her testimony. She informed David that she intended to honor Judge Harrison's ruling completely, retaining full control over all assets and businesses while offering him employment as a restaurant manager under her supervision. The offer was generous considering his behavior, but it represented a complete reversal of the power dynamic he had taken for granted throughout their marriage. David's desperate attempts to negotiate some form of partnership or shared ownership were met with Margaret's polite but firm refusal. She explained that his actions during the divorce proceedings had demonstrated that he could not be trusted with authority over assets that belonged to her family, and that any future relationship between them would be strictly professional. Margaret's final conversation with Veronica was perhaps the most satisfying moment of the entire ordeal. When Veronica attempted to blame Margaret for David's deceptions, claiming that any reasonable wife would have informed her husband about such substantial family wealth, Margaret's response cut through the younger woman's arguments with surgical precision. Margaret pointed out that Veronica had pursued a married man specifically because of his apparent wealth and success, never showing interest in his character or his treatment of his wife. She noted that Veronica's reaction to learning the truth about David's financial situation proved that her feelings had been based entirely on material considerations rather than genuine affection. The conversation concluded with Margaret's observation that Veronica had received exactly what she had sought, a relationship with David that was based on his true character and actual resources rather than on the facade he had maintained with Margaret's unwitting support. The irony was so complete that even Veronica seemed to understand that she had gotten precisely what she deserved. Margaret's exit from the courthouse was observed by the same crowd that had watched her enter 3 days earlier as an apparently defeated woman. But now she walked with the bearing of someone who had achieved complete victory through patience and careful planning rather than through luck or legal maneuvering. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's handling of her reclaimed business empire demonstrated the same careful intelligence that had guided her approach to the divorce proceedings. She promoted competent employees who had been overlooked during David's management, improved working conditions and wages, and implemented efficiency improvements that increased profitability across all locations. David accepted the position of restaurant manager that Margaret offered, working under the supervision of people who had previously been his subordinates. His former friends and business associates treated him with the mixture of pity and embarrassment reserved for someone whose fall from grace had been both dramatic and entirely self-inflicted. Veronica's departure from David's life was swift and complete. Once she understood that his promises of wealth and status had been empty, she ended their relationship with the same calculating efficiency she had brought to its beginning. David found himself alone in a modest apartment, dependent on Margaret's generosity for employment and facing a future that bore no resemblance to the plans he had made. Margaret's treatment of David was consistently professional but distant, offering him the respect she would show any employee while maintaining clear boundaries about their personal relationship. She never displayed cruelty or vindictiveness, but her messages were unmistakable. David had chosen his path, and now he would live with the consequences of decisions that had seemed so clever when he believed himself to hold all the power. The story became something of a legend within the local legal community, cited as an example of the importance of understanding all aspects of a case before making confident predictions about its outcome. Patricia Blackwell's reputation recovered eventually, but she never again entered a courtroom without conducting exhaustive research into every possible avenue of investigation. Margaret returned to her quiet lifestyle, managing her business interests with the same careful attention she had brought to everything else, while maintaining the modest public profile that had served her so well during her marriage. She had proven her point about patience and intelligence triumphing over arrogance and assumption, and she seemed content to let that victory speak for itself. Those of you who have stayed with this story from the beginning have witnessed something remarkable, a demonstration that quiet strength and careful planning can overcome even the most overwhelming odds. Margaret's patience and intelligence allowed her to turn David's own arrogance against him, proving that the most dangerous opponent is often the one who appears to be powerless. I hope this story has given you something to think about, whether you're dealing with your own challenges or simply enjoying the satisfaction of watching justice prevail. If you found Margaret's journey as compelling as I did, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the best victories are the ones that take years to achieve, and sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who never need to raise their voices to make themselves heard.